Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this evening's program. You can see from the panel that we have a summit meeting indeed. And we at Columbia University are very mindful of the specialness of this gathering and of the graciousness of our guests and coming here to join us tonight. We've had quite a day already hearing papers about Louis Armstrong and presentations, and John Faddis almost blew the windows out when he tried to show us what it sounded like to sound like Louis Armstrong. So we've had a good time already, and it's been very exciting to think about the legacy of this great man. We were topped off this afternoon by a visit with Sheila Jordan, and that was just an unbelievable moment to have her come forward. It was just so great. And so you can see that we've had a day, and we're here to celebrate Louis Armstrong. I'm Bob O'Mealy from the Center for Jazz Studies, and I want to express my appreciation to the Louis Armstrong Educational Foundation, which has been our supporting group for some years now, right from the beginning. They believed in our vision, and we're very, very grateful for that. Tonight we get to visit with four truly great Americans who are also great world citizens, who will testify tonight about jazz and jazz in a time of emergency. And I don't have to tell you what that means, because here we are, standing in the need of prayer if we ever were. And we have great people to help us direct our thinking along those lines. Armstrong was a virtuoso in the double sense I was talking about earlier today. He was virtuous, and he could make you feel the different ways that he was virtuous when he played. He was a generous person. He loved people. He loved children. He was playful, and you could feel that. But he also cared about his community. He was very well known by his neighbors, as somebody who just liked to sit out front and visit with people. He would fill his pockets with $50 bills and just hand them out to people who looked like they could stand a break at that moment. So he was a generous man. When he died, he left his money to jazz education. So when you go to Jazz for Young People at Jazz at Lincoln Center, it's Pops letting you in the door. When there's a program at Jazz Mobile or a program at the summer camp in New Orleans, it's Pops' generosity that you feel. Every student at Columbia, as you heard earlier from the dean, is required to study jazz as part of our as part of our music history program. Every student must study jazz, and that's because of the support of Louis Armstrong in the background, making it happen. Jazz is required here not just because it's something you should know about, but because of certain values that are going to be touched on a bit tonight. We like to argue about the word jazz, and some people like to quote Ellington as saying, we don't use the word jazz anymore, and so on. But we're not going to give the word up. And we're not going to give up, you know what I'm saying? And we're not going to give up certain definitions of the music either. This is a music that depends on improvisation. And other people improvise, but usually I don't want to hear them do it for so long. Compared to what Sarah Vaughan could do and compared to what Billie Holiday and Pops could do, okay, it's great. Improvisation is a jazz quality. I don't want to give up the idea that blues is part of jazz. And that, there was a radio announcer in D.C. who would interrupt himself. He'd say, today don't forget the blues, y'all. And we're going to do the weather. Don't forget the blues, y'all. And we can't forget this legacy of the music's facing up to the fact that life is a low-down, dirty shame. And that it's worth living. And that we're going to have a party right on time, just as planned in spite of everything. So we don't want to give up the blues. There are a lot of other definitions that we could go into, but the final one I want to touch on tonight is the quality of swing. And the great drummer Leroy Williams is sitting back there, and he always says, watch the four on the floor. You watch their feet. They're talking about swinging. There's that dance beat thing is in there. If we call it jazz, that's in there. there's a philosophical aspect to all of these three things. In order to play jazz, you have to play yourself. That's what Sheila Jordan said today. Play your life. You have to sound like yourself, or it's not jazz. It's you imitating Sonny Stitt or somebody. You must have an individual voice, but you also have to listen to the people around you. And swinging in that sense, not only just having a good momentum, but having a sense of the other people that you're swinging into and out of their lives as dancers and listeners, as well as people on the stage with you. So there's a communitarian, there's a love that's built into the music. Not just of yourself, you sound like yourself, but you better not sound like yourself and nobody wants to hear it. And so these are some of the values in the background as we ask these great men to talk about jazz in a time of emergency. What on earth are we going to do now? Our first speaker tonight, and what I'm going to do, I'll introduce every one of them and then ask them to come up to give a short statement and then have a roundtable discussion after. I'm going to introduce them in the briefest way so I can get out the way sooner than I've done already. Maybe not soon enough. And each one will make a short statement and then we'll have discussion. Our first speaker is the Honorable Marc Morial. Mr. Morial, on my left here, is the president of the National Urban League. He's the former mayor of New Orleans. He's a lawyer who, for a lifetime, has fought the fight for social justice. He's part of a family of leaders. His father was the mayor. His mother has written an important book about putting your body on the line when the time comes. So we're very delighted to have him as our speaker, to say the least. And I'm going to introduce each one and then ask one by one to come up. The second speaker will be the Reverend Dr. M. William Howard. He's the pastor emeritus on the end of the line here of Bethany Baptist Church in Newark. That's a church, if you know that church, that has a long legacy of social justice and fighting and saying, everybody, it's time to go out and do what we have to do. He's an eloquent man who's been telling the truth for a lifetime in the most eloquent terms. Community outreach defines that church's mission as much as anything else. It's also had a Jazz Vespers program that's very well known. And so jazz people come through that church routinely as part of it, what it means to be in the spirit, to hear that music standing for these values. And so we welcome you with open arms. Our third speaker is Professor Michael Dyson. Reverend Dr. Dyson is a dear old friend of mine. He's a lot older than he looks. No, he's we've been playing at Dozens for a long, long time, he and I. He's Reverend Doctor is a public intellectual and defines what that term means. You've seen him on television and in the media and radio. He's got so many books speaking on topics of the day. Some of you heard him speak so eloquently at Aretha Franklin's funeral. Some people didn't speak eloquently, and some people did. He was right on time as far as that went. He's a professor of sociology at Georgetown University, the author of too many books to name, the newest one called What Truth Sounds Like. So we can watch for that. He has a book on Kings called I May Not Get There With You, which is a great book. Our final speaker, batting cleanup is a home run hitter, is Honorable Ross Baraka. We're so honored that the celebrated mayor of Newark, or as his father and others might say, the Newark, is here. He has a background in poetry and spoken word, and you can feel that every time he speaks. He's an eloquent man. You can feel the background of the Baraka family when he speaks too. Both of his parents are poets, and poets of the kind of responsibility. I was telling him I knew his father, and his father would get out there in front of the bus, and like nobody I've ever met in my life. He was an heroic champion and a man of words and deeds. He's also the brother of our own Kelly, and so we welcome him on that double family mission. And so please join me in welcoming the panel, and first of all, Honorable Marc Morial.
Thank you very much, Brother Bob, and thank you for having me here at Columbia University. I want to begin by saluting and saying thank you to my very good friend, Jackie Harris. Where's Jackie? Jackie, who you all know for her work with the Louis Armstrong Foundation, served as a member of my cabinet when I was mayor of New Orleans for 8 years. And I decided when I got elected that the cultural economy and the cultural elements of the city were not being promoted effectively by city government. So we created a Music and Entertainment Commission as a part of the Mayor's Office of Tourism and Arts to really focus on elevating the contributions, the incredible music contributions of New Orleans to every single thing that we did. It, I think, culminated in a high point when, in connection with the 100th birthday of Louis Armstrong, I made the decision to rename the airport in New Orleans after Louis Armstrong. And so that airport bears the name, the Louis Armstrong International Airport. And I cringe whenever I land in New Orleans and the pilot doesn't say that. Because that's the name, the official name of the airport, because the history of Louis Armstrong, which is so critical, is that he is, of course, New Orleans' most famous and most favorite son. But as a New Orleanian in the early 20th century, what is notable and noteworthy and must be understood is that he had to find his way to Chicago and eventually New York to get respect for his music, to be able to monetize his music. And such was the case for so many early jazz artists from New Orleans, whether it was Buddy Bolden or whether it was Jelly Roll Morton or any of the greats. They had to leave New Orleans. I'm proud to count amongst my own family members one of those musicians, Kid Ory. Kid Ory was the brother of my great-grandmother. And I heard about Kid from the time I was very, very little with great pride as a part of our family. I want to just underscore, and I'm just a warm-up act for these incredible speakers and presenters, that we have to always understand Armstrong and jazz music as a part of the 20th century movement for social and economic change, civil rights, and justice. We look at jazz now, and many people look at jazz with a great deal of respect for what it is and as America's really original art form, music that was created here in America with the strong influence of Black Americans. But it's important to understand that jazz was vilified in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. Jazz musicians were into race mixing. Jazz musicians were into smoking marijuana. Jazz musicians were playing what classical artists considered to be gut bucket music, Dr. Dyson. And it was vilified and criticized. Yet today, it is, I think, the American classical music. Its power and for what it represents. And that's why we got to lift it up. And so before the tradition of soul, R&B, and hip-hop, there was jazz. And soul, R&B, and hip-hop, also in their earliest formations were criticized and put down. Hip-hop criticized and put down. By studying jazz, we can understand jazz was the antecedent for all of these musical genres. Here's what's important, and I think this is an element, and those who know jazz really well understand this. Jazz really was formed when African Americans who had the gospel music and blues tradition got an opportunity to get their hands on these horns and instruments in New Orleans, which were primarily being used by these French marching bands because of New Orleans' colonization by the French traditions. And when those two things melded together is how jazz was born. It was the rhythm, it was the swing, it was the soul of black people being, if you will, expressed through these traditional European instruments, primarily horns, cornets, and trumpets, and trombones, etc. And in a unique sense, that blend created modern jazz music and early jazz music. When I think of Louis Armstrong, one story I will always remember is that in 1998, I had an opportunity to visit the Czech Republic. And on a mission there, had an opportunity to sit down with the mayor of Prague, which is the capital of the Czech Republic. I spoke not his native tongue, he spoke not my native tongue. And I introduced myself and I said that I was from New Orleans. He immediately, out of his mouth, said, "Louis Armstrong." He runs in the back and brings out an old newspaper from 1966 where Louis Armstrong played to literally tens of thousands in the public square in Prague. Armstrong was a well-known American, but a well-known global citizen, known throughout the world. And so that connection, and think about it, 1966, Prague is when Czechoslovakia was part of the Soviet Empire. And for Armstrong to be there and performing his music was an incredible feat of international diplomacy in 1966. I know this panel today is going to shed a lot of light and a lot of insight. But what I am pained by, and this is something I've had multiple long conversations, Jackie, with Marcellus about, is how we don't do enough so that the newest generations of people, young people, understand and know not only Louis Armstrong and his contributions, but jazz music. And we have to do more. It should be integrated into the music education curriculum of every school that teaches music anywhere in America. How can you can't talk about Beethoven and Brahms and Tchaikovsky and Stravinsky without talking about Louis. He's on par with them as an impact player in culture. He exceeds them, in my own opinion, in his impact on social and economic change and justice. Long live Louis, because I know what it means to miss New Orleans. You'll pardon me. I have to excuse myself. I have a 16-year-old son to pick up from a basketball game. But I have you know he is an honor student also. He will be applying to Columbia University and Georgetown University and Howard University and the University of Pennsylvania, and we'll see what happens. So thank you.
Whose computer is that? Do we know whose computer this is? Somebody needs it. It looks like a good one. Maybe I could just, I'm at least close it. And here we go.
I always like to hear applause when I sit down. It's risky to applaud me before I speak. Pure delight to be in the presence of the people who are part of this presentation today. And listening to the mayor talk about New Orleans, and it's been, the assignment given me is to talk about spirituality. And I think about the Haitian roots that can be found in New Orleans. I think about voodoo, which is a legitimate religion, I might say. And in general, the spirit world that by necessity invades and permeates the New Orleans space. I listened to the professor talk about the different components of jazz, improvisation, and so on, and he mentioned the blues. And I'm going to date myself by saying I make a point of forcing myself, oh, I'm getting in trouble, to listen to some of the talented young artists today, and I don't hear enough of the blues. For me, I'm lost without the blues as the root. I grew up in Southwest Georgia. Forgive my posture. I'm leaning here because I don't see so well. I grew up in Southwest Georgia listening to Jimmy Reed and Sonny Boy Williamson and Lil Willie John and Howlin' Wolf and Bobby Blue Bland. I know you've been hurt by somebody else. You know that one? I can tell by the way you carry yourself. Well, if you don't know that song, I'm going to say a little prayer for you. But in the end, the word of hope comes through. I'll take care of you. And the blues is a precursor. It is the product of redemptive suffering, but it culminates in celebration. And when I think of Louis Armstrong, who, as you certainly know, was not born on easy street, I associate the celebration in his music and in his face with trials and tribulations. The blues being the root cause of celebration. And that, I think, speaks, as Jackie, you guys wanted me to speak about, and that is the relevance of that to our moment. I'm not on Facebook. When I learned that Cambridge Analytica was publishing my information, I left. I hold on to Twitter in case I need to tell Aubrey I'm in trouble, and you can see. But I see a lot of, Junius, sort of downcast posts from my people. Most of the people I'm connected to on Twitter outside of news organizations are people I actually know. And I hear a lot of bitterness and a lot of hints of hopelessness and pessimism. And I said, there's somebody who never heard Bobby Blue Bland. You know, everybody knows about B.B. King. I assume we know about Albert King. He's got that song, I Met My Baby in the Local Laundromat. And if you know anything about a laundromat, that's the last place you expect something good to happen, right? But he met his baby in the local laundromat. So, you know, it ranks right up there with, if it hadn't been for bad luck, I wouldn't have had no luck at all. Right. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be in this discussion, and I'll hope to have something to say in the course of our discussion together. But for me, and I need to say this because as a retired pastor, when they ask you to speak about spirituality, it's easy to be misjudged. So spirituality, for me, refers to one's regard for the unseen world versus the material or tangible world. And to many people, spirituality actually lies, to many people, outside of the orbit of organized religion or conventional religious dogma. The implications of what I will say probably touches more on the latter concept. So spirituality to me is reality. It's just a reality you don't see. It is a life force that influences our world, although not seen with, as they say in the church, the naked eye. So 18 years ago, when we launched the Vespers at Bethany, which the mayor will tell you is a very traditional Black Baptist church. He knows it well because Amiri was baptized in that church. We dared to try this. It wasn't easy in a traditional church. Many people inside and outside the church have asked me, why did you conceive of something featuring jazz in the church? And I always say that I wanted the people in the church to know that not all of God's music was in the hymn book. And we were privileged to host vocalists from time to time, but honestly, we were careful about vocalists because lyrics can sometimes be too defining. They can sometimes the reach can be limited. And we know there are many wonderful, awe-inspiring lyrics out there, but when you invite jazz artists to perform, they've been so alienated from the church for so long, there's no telling what might come out of their mouths, you know? Except people like Gregory Porter and Ruth Naomi Floyd, Liz Wright, and some others notwithstanding. The congregation is usually filled with people who never go to church otherwise. Jews, Muslims, Christians, they all come, even non-believers and undeclared believers. I remember, Junius, in that one of the early Vespers, we had an altar call. People thought they had come to a concert, so they were confused. They looked around to see who else was going. And now the altar is flooded by agnostics, professed atheists. Everybody needs a place to come and empty themselves. Many come in the first instance because they're jazz fans, but soon they feel the music's message is reaching them in a different way. They hear the music now being played in a church sanctuary, so they hear through the ear of spirit. Now, I have to tell you, and you won't consider me credible unless I tell you this, there were a whole lot of people who didn't get with this. Do you understand? But 18 years later, Vespers hosts world-class artists every first Saturday, 9 months out of the year, and every Sunday morning in August. I wish, actually, and there are Bethany members in the house, so I wish I could say that I was so brilliant that I brought them along. But the music made the argument for us. There was Deacon Major who was skeptical, so we brought him to St. Peter's one Sunday, or was it Saturday, Sunday, to experience a wonderful artist by the name of Juanita Fleming. And Juanita Fleming has a grand blues voice, and she was accompanied by a very excellent sort of jazz quartet. And then she sang gospel music. And the good deacon said, "Pastor, if that's what a jazz Vespers is, let's get one." Liz Wright came down in Georgia, Vienna. Some of you say Vienna, but in Georgia we say Vienna. And I'm going to be brief. I'm ending. Liz had been alienated from her family for so many years because she had opted to sing what people call jazz. And on the night she was appearing, her father and brother were somehow in the area, and they came to hear her for the first time singing in the church. Sometime during that night, the father stood up from his place about midway in the sanctuary and began to walk forward. And we saw a family reunion. This, what do you say, this lamp trimmed and burning. They began to sing. Every Vespers had a few skeptics. Every time we met, like the newspaper coming to see what kind of negative information they could get, these skeptics would come to the jazz Vespers, and when they would see experiences like this, they heard the Spirit. And Mary Lou's Bass, my sister, you were a part of it. It was undeniably from the fount of faith, but composed by one of the giants in so-called jazz, with Jerry Allen orchestrating this, with Carmen Lundy singing, Brother Dwight playing that saxophone. The skeptics began to get weak. Randy Weston came and took them somewhere they didn't even know they had been, to the depths of ancient Africa. Piano as percussion instrument. God bless his soul. But my, oh my, the Spirit was irresistible, and we never said a mumbling word. In fact, we didn't have words to explain what was happening or what was going to happen. So the music really spoke for us. So many musicians would come through playing Come Sunday, Ellington's, or Dear Lord by our dear brother John. I remember that evening when Barry Harris came to play, and somewhere, as you've seen that little show he puts on with the chorus, he's there doing his thing, and up stood 8 or 10 people from the sanctuary humming, My Lord. And then the great acid test in the Baptist church is people start joining the church at the jazz vespers. Oh, my Lord. Jerry Allen is baptized. Sheila Anderson, some of you know that name, my good friend, WBGO. Sheila grew up Catholic in Buffalo. And she, as most lapsed Catholics, and there are a few in this room, struggled with her faith, and I became her church. She came to church almost every week, like during the week, to talk to me, question me. And finally, one Sunday, she got up enough nerve to join the church. She walked down, some of you know how this goes, and then she lost her nerve. She wouldn't get baptized. Jerry gave her the courage. They went in the pool on the same day. And the skeptics were watching. But the Spirit, when it is unleashed, it's powerful. You see, it's like the wind. It's like a breath. You see those people down in Florida now? They're not out there trying to box the wind. They know the wind just keeps coming. And this was our experience with the music. And there are simply no words, as I say. That instrumental music cannot reduce to meaninglessness. And that instrumental music gives souls the option to explore the feelings that well up in the people as they hear the sounds. Now, this is not a speech against vocalists. But you know, if I had to have a vocalist give me a scatter, like speaking in tongues, you know. Or I listen to Leon Thomas, you know, the Pharoah Sanders recording. What is he doing, yodeling? Don't ask me what he said, right? But you feel what he's doing. So people almost immediately felt that spirit, not the spirit of frivolity. There is such a spirit as that. But the spirit of a deep yearning and of inspiration emanating from the artist's deepest quest for meaning and purpose. And I believe our sense of what is spiritual and our palpable connection to it is the human being's highest aspiration. You may not call it Jesus or Allah or Yahweh or whatever, Buddha, huh? But we're all on that journey because none of us asked to come. And we all know we got to leave. And if we can manage not to be threatened by the mystery and unpredictableness of this life, or unpredictability of this life, and somehow if we can find ways, Aubrey, to be reconciled to this mystery as a gift, akin to mercy and grace. You can't earn it. And as the folks say in the church, I love you. And there ain't nothing you can do about it. The Spirit is like that. It's present. It will have its way, and there's nothing you can do about it. And if we can find peace with the mystery of the Spirit, we will have reached a high form of spiritual maturity. And you know, the people you're going to tell us about in that new book, they know nothing about what I'm talking about. Do you understand? They are so crippled by dogmatics and shortcuts. And it always leads you to a dead end. And incidentally, I didn't read that in a book. I'm giving you a little taste of a journey. Rigid dogma may do all it can do to contain the human quest, but it will inevitably fail because of the radically different routes we travel to find that connection, if we ever do. There are too many places along the journey where scatting and groaning communicates exactly what we feel far better than a well-articulated conventional language. Grandma Minnie would be in the kitchen on Saturday cooking. So, down those days you didn't cook on Sunday. So it was painful, Jackie. I'm sitting down. It was painful because I love fried chicken and I had to wait till Sunday. You know how that goes? And she would say, or Lord have mercy. Nobody's there, just her, right? I'm in the other room someplace. But these expressions, ineffable, speaking from the depths of human desire and compassion. Jazz musicians, we know, they need a script many times, but they wouldn't be what they are to us if they stuck to it. And when Louis Armstrong played, people could hear the ecstasy in his sound and they could see it in his face. That's what I hear in this introduction to West End Blues. Wendon says he can't even play it. I mean, that ain't wrote down nowhere. That comes from somewhere down in the belly of a man who has known rivers, beloved. So his smile, which was perennial, was not a smile because of what he knew, but a smile despite what he knew. And that was a smile of joy. Pop's life was no stranger to suffering. We can be sure that that joy came not from his life on the flower bed of ease, as the old folk used to say, but from the irrepressible spirit that is life itself. From the breath, from the wind. Instruments are physical things. They help to make the sounds, but the life force that resides deeply in the personality of each artist is what determines if our own life will be changed by what they give us. The life force which transcends secular belief, sectarian belief, dogmatic belief is conjured from redemptive suffering that can give us all the courage to resist a world where people are denied respect, equity, and safety wherever they live. And it can sustain us when we are tempted to surrender, to become cynical. It can prevent us from caving in to the alternative truths that we are confronted with every day. if you will simply listen. God bless you.
Thank you so kindly. What a great honor it is to be here at Columbia and with all of these great scholars and the Dean of Jazz Studies, or as I like to call him, Methuselah. I think he was there when Armstrong made his first recording. You're a great man, sir. You don't look a day over 100. But you know, but here with the great Farrah Jasmine Griffin, always great to be in her presence. And the great Aubrey Hendricks, my man, Tanya, Deidre, you know, the whole gang is here. But to be on this panel with that great and stirring lesson we just heard, and then bringing it all together, the mayor, who's a prophet and poet. I must say, I'll cut down on some of my presentation just to respond to Reverend Howard. I think you presented a powerful challenge in regard to the young people, but they are singing the blues, sir, I must say. And it would behoove older people to listen to some of these younger people, not only literally. You will be surprised at how many blues songs have been sampled by hip-hop artists, right? Albert King with Big Daddy King, Albert King with Jay-Z's phenomenal song you never heard of because it begins with Farrakhan. And it's one of the most poignant explorations of the suffering of young black men, right? Yes, sir. And his song, Ain't No Heart, Heart of the City, Ain't No Love, reversing Bobby Blue Bland, whom you mentioned. First, the Fat Boys break up. Now, every day I wake up and somebody got a problem with Hov. What's up, your cat's all fed up because I got a little cheddar and my record's moving out the stove, right? With the Bobby Blue Bland, and responds back to him. When Bobby raises the question, he said, where's the love? So the blues is the predicate for so much of the suffering. And if I might say, even though I make fun of it just for rhetorical purposes, but what is mumble rap but the blues? Because they done tried lyricism, clearly articulated, clearly intoned rhetoric in defense of their humanity, and people still shoot them. So now they're going to put it where you can't get it. The same way Armstrong was arguing against the boppers, bebop in particular. What they did is said, oh, you don't want to hear it? Walk up the comments, 100,000, 100,000, 150,000, 160,000, 100,000. And you want what they saying? They saying something, masking it, because you have not heard what they have been saying, so now they re-articulate it at a moment of mumble rap as the articulation and expression of moans and guttural articulations from the hood. But I just would want to join that with what you were saying, because it's so important. I study these cats too much. I mean, Professor Griffin helped award Kendrick Lamar, right, the Pulitzer Prize. Kendrick Lamar is the blues. Like in hip-hop is the blues. If you listen to Damn, or if you listen to Pimp a Butterfly, and if you hear so much of his art, there is a guttural cry that they want their elders to hear, and a spiritual dimension to it too. Just the other day, I got lynched by some crooked cops, and to this day, them same cops on the beat getting major pay. But when I get my check, they taking tax out, so we paying the cops to knock the blacks out. I mean, they are suffering in such a serious way. So with your brilliant presentation about the blues and Bobby Blue Bland and some of those lyrics, I mean, the blues lyrics that can never be duplicated. If you're going to walk across my lawn, at least you can take off your shoes. Hey, lady, your husband is cheating on us. Anyway, right? But let me get to my points. I ain't got but a few, right? So my assignment is to talk about Satchmo, Satchel Mouth, because it was so wide, but it carried the burden of a people in that gravelly voice to talk about Louis Armstrong and freedom. And my philosophical training tells me freedom from and freedom to. Stopping stuff from happening that prohibits the flourishing of a people or an individual aesthete, or the freedom to explore and express so broadly and widely the human dimensions of one's characteristic art. So I got a few places where I think Armstrong finds freedom. First of all, in the dressing room, right? I mean, I got to read you this. From a fellow player about Louis Armstrong's dressing room. He says he'd be sitting down in his underwear with a towel around his lap, one around his shoulders, and that white handkerchief on his head. And he put that grease around his lips. Looked like a minstrel man, you know? And laughing, you know, natural the way he is. And in the room, you see maybe two nuns. You see a streetwalker dressed up in all flaming clothes. You see maybe a guy come out of a penitentiary. You see maybe a blind man sitting there. You see a rabbi. You see a priest, see? Liable to see maybe two policemen or detectives, see? You see a judge. All of them different levels of society in the dressing room, and he's talking to all of them. Sister so-and-so, do you know Slick Sam over there? This is Slick Sam, an old friend of mine. Now the nun's going to meet Slick Sam. Old Notorious, been in 9 penitentiaries. Slick Sam, meet Rabbi Goldstein over there. He's a friend of mine. Rabbi, good man, religious man. Sister Margaret, do you know Rabbi Goldstein? Amelia, this is Rosie. Good time, Rosie. Girl used to work in a show with me years ago. Good girl, she's a great performer. Never got the breaks. Always, end of quote, always a word of encouragement, see? And there'd be some kids there, white and colored, all the diverse people of different social levels. And everybody's looking, got their eyes dead on him, just like they was looking at a diamond. I mean, that alone kills the show. That alone kills the show. Louis Armstrong's dressing room is better than Donald Trump's cabinet. Right? Because it's a democratic space. It's integrating every level of society. It's bringing the hangers-on and those who hang well. It's bringing the demonized and the stigmatized of society and forcing them into conversation with the highfalutin and those on one side of the law versus those on the other. It is such a radically democratic space because it gave voice to his sense and aesthetic of swing. And it was a deeply and profoundly, as Wynton Marsalis speaks about that, as Albert Murray talks about it, and certainly amplified by Stanley Crouch, that democratic aesthetic at the heart of Armstrong's vision is rooted in the existential anxiety and the misery of common working people, giving rise to his own sense of swing. Then it was in his diction. Not only his dressing room, but his diction. And you know, many books could be written about what Armstrong did. First of all, he wrote his own stuff. I'm talking about his literary stuff, right? Ain't no ghostwriter. He actually written that, he's writing that himself. And he took real pleasure in swinging, cold swinging, between what he called straight English and jive talk. He wrote a column for a few newspapers that was called Jive Talk. And he reveled in that ability to be able to go with highfalutin stuff. He carried dictionaries and thesauruses in his valise. He was unashamed about embracing literacy in a day and age when we have shrunken from it, when we are ashamed to use phrases that might be out of the reach of so-called ordinary people in order to articulate the needs and desires of ordinary people. He was unashamed and unafraid to do that, and he made a life lesson in writing about it. And when you look at his writing, it's not quite as powerful as his playing. It doesn't have the powerful intensity of the cold switching that he could do so easily. I mean, leaving New Orleans with the collective enterprise of an aesthetic rooted in a common denominator among many players to becoming the most virtuosic soloist, arguably in the history of jazz and certainly in the earlier history of jazz. That's who he was. And that diction was critical to him, and he was not shunning it, not putting it aside, not going around the country as a comedian dogging people who use language even as you create Fat Albert. I'll leave that alone. Thirdly, his freedom was in his diary. As y'all know, Armstrong spoke into a microphone for 650 reel-to-reel tapes. And if you want to get the real sense of freedom that Armstrong embodied, check out what he was saying on them tapes. Everybody thought he was a smiling, minstrel-like black man, dark-skinned black man in a culture that was still in love with light skin. And that ebullient, radiant darkness that he emanated, because he was dark not only in his skin. Drake says, I'm light-skinned, but I'm still a dark nigga. That's all right, y'all can't even hear that. We discussed at the National Association of Negro Men Who Love Black Women the other week. It was great. So what's interesting, y'all slow, I ain't got much time. So, right? So here he is, smiling, having to defer. Younger people wondering why gray-haired old men and women act so deferential in the face of power, so that your black ass could live, so that you could emerge. And so he poured the agony of his hurt into those tapes, looking and talking about white people who treated him with disrespect. The rage was hot. The anxiety was deep. And Armstrong talked about that, expressing his rage at white supremacy, at the outlaw behavior that he was ostensibly supposed to have embodied just by sight, and rebelling against what white people made of him. So all those folk who thought he was cooning didn't understand the degree to which he was engaging, and not only in code switching, but I guess what James Scott and Robin Kelly picks up on it, infrapolitics. The invisible layer beneath the surface of what was going on, because blackness is nothing if it's not signifying. And Louis Armstrong was one of the greatest signifiers we have had. But it's not only in his diary, he had freedom in his dope. Right? He loved Mary Jane. He and Rick James could have made a song together. I'm in love with Mary Jane. Right? He loved that marijuana. And I don't know if it's an apocryphal story or not, but he said one of the reasons why he stayed high so much every day is so he could deal with the vicious intensity and the lethal expression of white supremacy. Every day, ingesting that marijuana. It was medical marijuana, right? To make sane a black male mind in the midst of a culture where just a look could get you lynched. Reckless eyeballing, they call it. Ishmael Reed makes brilliant use of that. That black men in particular, through the optic nerve, right? Isn't it interesting? The optic nerve is the central metaphor for the distribution of knowledge in Western empiricism and epistemology. Cartesian dualism is predicated upon the glassy essence of the mind. Read Richard Rorty in 1979, The Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. These metaphors have governed the conception of knowledge in the modern West. And yet the victims of that knowledge, the Humean causality that could never save their lives, the Cartesian dualism that could never see the intense beauty of the black soul, this is what Armstrong was warring against in such a beautiful and fundamental way. And so he blew that horn and he blew that weed. And then finally, he was free in his declaration. And when you think about that voice of his, it is uber American, so powerful. That gravelly voice, raspy, with the harsh coverage and surveillance of black life, speaking back to America in terms that were all his own. That declaration through that voice, and as Reverend Howard talked about that scatting, I guess it's erotic glossolalia. I mean, there's something about it. Now, on those tapes, he was arguing with Jelly Roll Morton, who said that Louis Armstrong did not invent what heebie-jeebies in 1925-26, right, scat singing. And he's talking into the mic. He said, I disagree with you, young man. Of course, he's dead, Jelly Roll Morton. And he said, oh, yeah, I ain't heard it from nowhere else. I did it on my own. Now, the apocryphal story was, well, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not. He's playing music. The music drops on the ground. You know, he can't figure out the words, so he starts articulate something else. Well, those of us in that spiritual tradition like to talk about the moans and groans being interpreted by the Spirit. And so that's secular glossolalia. That's secular speaking in tongues for black people who are outside the church. And the reason that there's real tension is that sometimes the jazz musicians and instrumentalists embody the didache, the kerygma, the theology better than the people inside the church. Because Louis Armstrong's dressing room is a judgment against condescending sanctuaries that exclude gay bodies and trans bodies and queer bodies and female bodies and poor bodies too. And so yeah, that declaration and then ending with that trumpet in that cornet, that sound. Arguably the saxophone is the closest thing to the human voice, maybe through Coltrane, maybe through Stitt, but that trumpet in that bell rang out the humanity of black people. And Armstrong said, every time I blow that horn, I close my eyes and I see New Orleans, where I came from. And in my arguments with the great Wynton Marsalis, who's always arguing against jazz music, I said, both of y'all, hip hop and jazz, came from the brothel, from the bottom, from the dregs of society, as Luther would put it. And so that horn blew our intense passion and devotion to our humanity, and our refusal to hear other sounds determine who we are. When Armstrong blew that horn, he was blowing away all of the drivel that denied our humanity and amplifying the deepest passions that we could generate when we allowed our humility to match up with our talent to produce genius. Thank you.
So one, I just want to say it's a pleasure to be here. I'm humbled. Thank you for setting me up here. I appreciate that. And having to speak after 3 lectures that were already given. Feel like I was in school for a minute, and good school at that. But you know, I don't know what's left to be said. And the real part of it is everybody was given an assignment but me. So, I feel like that means I can say what I want to say, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I mean, I can do what I want to do up here, right? And so I was listening to everybody. So I listened to Mayor Morial in the beginning talking about how jazz was viewed in the beginning in a negative kind of way. I would say it still is. I wouldn't say it viewed. I mean, I just sitting over there was curious about that. So I just looked up what they actually had to say about jazz, and it defines, this Wikipedia thing defines the 1920s jazz music evolved into an integral part of American popular culture. The primitive jazz sound that had originated in New Orleans diversified and thus began to appeal to people from every echelon of society. It goes on, it reaches into a primal place inside. And finally, and it says a lot more crazy stuff, but it finally says a new jazz culture, jazz music influenced all aspects of society. Jazz music has also exacerbated the racial tensions in post-war period. Not lynching, jazz. Not Jim Crow.
Right.
Not voting rights or none of those things, public accommodations, just jazz. Jazz exacerbated racial tensions. Not the fact we was mad already, so we played some jazz, but the fact that we played jazz exacerbated some racial tensions. This is what's defined here for us. And, my foray into jazz music as a baby coming up in the Baraka household. Louis Armstrong said, if you have to ask what jazz is, you ain't never gonna know, right? You're never gonna know. So I never had to ask what jazz was because I experienced it, every single day, not just in the music, but in word and in action and in deed, every single day. And I think the topic is the political moment. Jazz, we've always been in a political moment. There's no time in history that we have not been in an emergency. Every period of our existence in this country has been an emergency, which is why we are used to crisis. As a matter of fact, we treat crisis as normal. Our response to crisis is actually, in a definition, in a real psychological or psychiatric definition, is abnormal, but we act as if it's normal. Our response to what's happened and what's happening to us is an emergency. It's always been. Look, if you look at, not just us speaking about it in the way that we want it to be a response to what's happening. At the end of the day, you had Charlie Mingus, The Fables of Faubus. You had John Coltrane, Alabama. You had Duke Ellington, Black, Brown, and Beige, right? You had all of these people responding to what was happening in society. And my father would say, and I'm paraphrasing, that to revere art and not to understand the forces that brought it into existence is not to understand what art is really. Right? And John Coltrane said, I want to be a force for good. Knowing that there are bad forces in the world that bring about misery, I want to be the opposite force to bring about good. Not just good, at the end of it he says real good. He's a jazz musician because he understands the difference between good and real good, right? Because he said he wanted to be a force for real good, meaning his music was not just about making people like it for some aesthetic value. He was saying what is happening to the world, to him, to his community, to all of us. He responded to that in a very outward and purposeful and intentional way. Jazz is a response. Music and art is brought about by social forces. If you look at the social and cultural forces that brought us to this country, and the music and the language, we communicated through music, and music was our language because it was illegal for us to talk to each other or read or discuss or communicate. So music became our language, whether it was the ring shout or gospel, right, or the blues, and then jazz. It turned into that. Today people beat. My dad used to say, we don't understand what they're saying anymore. We need a translator to understand what this actually means. This is why when people beat the drum now, don't nobody come, because don't nobody know what this means. At one point, it meant we in trouble. Meet me over here by the water. We getting the hell out of here tonight. Right? Now, people beating the drum, we don't know what that means. We think they're just banging on something. Right. We have been divorced from that continuum. So it's not just the fact that all of the music today comes from the beginning of blues and jazz and all of that stuff. We don't understand its lineage. We don't understand the historiography of it all. We don't understand how it was birthed into existence. What is the relationship that it has to one another? We don't even understand the language that we're speaking. It happens to us almost automatically, almost knee-jerk, almost reactionary because of the conditions that we're in. We say something like a baby who's smacked when he's born, he automatically cries. We've been crying for a long time. There's been a time that we understood what the crying meant. We're just a little confused about it today. So we need folks like us to begin to explain to people what is really going on, right? What are you responding to, right? And your cries and is related to something. There's a reason that people are sampling blues. There's a reason that they find Albert King interesting or Bobby Blue Bland interesting. There's a reason why all that James Brown or any of that stuff, why they find it interesting, why they believe that this is something that they should imitate or be a part of, because they're a part of that larger continuum, right? And it has to be explained to them, have to understand what's really, really, really happening here. It's important for us, as the mayor of the largest city in the state of New Jersey. We try to find many, many ways to communicate to people what we're doing, but how to come together and make our condition better. Because ultimately, that's what it's about. The uplifting of the human condition. That's what art and music itself is about, the uplifting of human condition, right? That's what it's about ultimately. So you can't study American history and not study jazz. We're not studying jazz because it's just a good thing to do. You can't understand history of America without understanding jazz. There's a whole piece missing you can't understand. Just like when you study classical, as was explained, Europe, you have to study the Renaissance because you understand the relationships between people, between art and music, what was going on in the world politically, in the church, what was going on in sectarian world, everywhere. You understand that through art, through painting, through sculpture, through music. And it was beautiful, right? It birthed the Renaissance. So jazz is, the 1920s in America means what to us? What does the 1920s mean to us? What did it mean to Louis Armstrong? Right. What did it mean to folks in New Orleans? What do we think of as African Americans when we think of the 1920s? What do we think of as African Americans when we think of the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement? When we think about Emmett Till. What do we think of when we think about the 60s? What comes to our mind? What do we imagine? What do we envision? Right? What do we want to play? What makes us feel good in that period of all of this stuff happening? What is that to us? And what is our relationship to America? And more importantly, what is America's relationship to us? Right. And the music explains that. It explains that almost in a way that many of us and all of our articulate capabilities can't explain. It explains it instantly. If you listen to John Coltrane's Alabama with no words, you automatically know what went on in Alabama when those 4 girls got blew up in that church. You could feel it. I played that in my elementary class in the 8th grade. I played John Coltrane's Alabama, and I read Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday, right? And made them write about what they felt about both of those things. What did they feel? First separately, and then what did they feel collectively together? How do you compare that to one another? This is 8th grade. If you listen to John Coltrane in Alabama, you know the melancholy of that. The immediate, the urgency of what was happening at that moment. 4 girls just got blown up in a church. Don't you hear it? He told a bunch of people, they just killed 4 girls in the church through that horn. They just blew up 4 girls in the church. The Klan is dangerous, is violent. White supremacy is real. This is what we have to go through in America. He said that in a song without saying one word. Without saying one word. And we all felt it, right? And I bet you, and today, if you went into a backstage in one of them hip-hop concerts and played John Coltrane's Alabama, everybody would know immediately what the hell was going on. And they would feel it intensely and immediately, and not only feel it, be able to relate to it, and might write a rhyme or two, a verse or two, a bar, write 6 or 7 bars after listening to Coltrane. After listening to Coltrane, because they can relate to it. And here's the problem with being able to relate to it. It kind of reiterates my point in the beginning that we've always been in an emergency. So they know what it feels like to walk outside and run from lynchers. They know what it feels like to be dehumanized, right? To be second class, to have dreams deferred, right? They know what the Fables of Faubus really was about. They know exactly what that means, right? But it hasn't been articulated to them in a way that they can make a real relationship, but they can feel it. They can feel it like you can feel a toothache, right? They can feel it. They can understand that it's there. This presence is there. We have to articulate what that is and not just talk about the music in a way that we, just revere it. Like a museum, like it's something to be looked at and not used. Something to be listened to, right? And not activated. So those things, it needs to be activated. It needs to be used. And that's the purpose. That's the reason why I think that's how I look at it. And that's how I grew up in a household where, WBGO played all day long. There's music that I don't know the title of, but when I hear it, I know what it is. Because we listened to WBGO more than we ate food. It was there all day long playing, and people came to our house and played, right? Whether you had Max Roach in the basement or Nina Simone singing and playing the piano in the living room, people played in the house. They jammed, they got together, they boogied, right? And more importantly, America didn't like jazz music the same way it didn't like hip-hop music, is because not only did it speak to our condition, it spoke to the human condition. That's right. And because it spoke to the human condition, everybody could ultimately relate to it, right? Who was progressive and wanted humanity and understood what humanity should be about, right? And wanted to be a part of a motion to move humanity into a place that's different than where we are in the present sense. And people gravitated towards that. They wanted to be a part of that. That's why you got people playing jazz that they don't even know what jazz is. They playing jazz, right? They don't even know what it is about, but they still involved in it. They still a part of it in some way, because we know that what's happening now is not right. It's not just. We know that the president of these United States shouldn't be there, right? We know that. In our heart of hearts and our mind of minds, we know he shouldn't be there. And we know everything around it is something wrong with what's happening. We know something's wrong. There's something wrong with what's going on now. You can feel it. Something wrong in the cabinet. There's something wrong everywhere. We feel uneasy about what's happening because something crazy is going on. Right. Even to a point where all of us, even those who've become comfortable with emergency, are getting scared. Right? Saying we are in dangerous times. Like yesterday, you wasn't in danger. Right. You was born in danger. Right. You came out of the womb in a dangerous time. It's dangerous for me all the time. For black boys in America, it's dangerous every day. It's always dangerous. So for us to say it's a dangerous time means it's a dangerous time.
It's real dangerous.
You know, like Coltrane said, it's real dangerous, right? We know the difference between dangerous and real dangerous. And that's what that means. So if we're trying to teach jazz and we're trying to understand what this music is about, right? We have to do it in the context of changing what's happening in the present tense. Changing what's happening, not just looking at it as it existed in the past, but viewing it as a force, as Coltrane put it, for real good, for changing the conditions, people's material conditions. And how does music do that? You excite them same way words do it. You excite people into action. You deepen their thought. You help their vision see clearly. You get them to think and hear, right? What's going on? You open up their senses, or like the young folks say today, right? You wake them up, right? So you wake them up, and I usually end with stay woke, but also stay informed, right? So because woke is just a state of consciousness, and jazz will wake you up. And once you are woke, once you experience that, you're not the same person you was yesterday. Once you start digging into some jazz and getting in that craze, you're not that same person you was. Once you understand what's happening really here, and you understand what that music is about, you're not the same person anymore. And so being woke allows you to go places you've never been, read things you never read, listen to folks you never listened to, hear speeches that you would never go to, be in circles you would never think to be a part of, right? Have jazz vespers in your church. It changes things. And so that's the importance of it. I played music and a lot of it Louis Armstrong. When I became a high school principal, I played music instead of bells. So instead of the bell ringing, the kids moved to music, right? They moved to either Carlos Santana, Tito Puente, Nina Simone, Curtis Mayfield, right? Billie Holiday, John Coltrane, Charlie Mingus, Sun Ra, you know, Pharoah Sanders, Little Gratian Moncor sometimes, you know. They moved to that music, and I only know that music because it was passed on to me. They listened to that music unbeknownst to themselves, and that happened to me because I used to play hip-hop, brother, in classrooms when I was an 8th grade teacher and a 7th grade teacher. I played hip-hop, and I went home and told my mother that, like I was doing something hip. I said, Mom, I'm playing hip-hop music in a class. She said, that's great, but they could listen to that without you. As she said, they listening to that without you. They don't need you for that. You should play something they would never hear. And I said, that's cool. I'm going to bring in Coltrane and Nina Simone. You shouldn't have told me that. And I've been doing it when I was an educator ever since. Music, and when people come in the building, they like, what is this music playing? Why are they playing this music? That's moving kids from, and not only was the music cool, it mellowed the place out, and kids moved to class in a cooler way. Sometimes they danced on the way to class, you know. I play big band, bebop, swing, or every part of it. I played it, right, because I was trying to exercise them, or exercise the demons out of them, right, or exercise the self-hatred out of them, I should say, and make them understand what tradition that they're from, who they are, what they have the capability to do, and say, that's hip. Who made that? And kids come say, where that music come from? Who's playing that? Who's singing that? And to be able to show them or give them a CD. Say, here, bring it back tomorrow. Right? To introduce them to themselves. Because if they lived in this country for too long, you don't get introduced to yourself here. You got to figure out who you are. Been running around for 40 years trying to find yourself. Some people, unfortunately, die and never know who they ever was. They haven't found themselves yet. They still searching, right? So we trying to introduce, and the deep thing about introducing them folks to themselves, because once they figure out who they are, you don't have to do nothing else. Once they realize who they are, everybody else is in trouble. Everybody who wouldn't tell them, they in trouble. Everybody they come across is in trouble. We don't need them to do anything else. Just introduce them to who they are, where they from, then they'll take care of everything else. You know, they take care. Somebody told me, a good reverend one day told me, Pastor Howard, that, we pray for miracles and God gives us children. And, to bring these things into existence, our job is to really just give them the information. He take care of the rest. We've been denying them this information. And so we need to give it to them, right? So they're not doing it as a reaction, but doing it very purposeful and deliberate and intentional. And if they did it that way, a lot more things will come down, but more importantly, a lot more things will be constructed. Thank you.
I want to invite people to ask our panelists a question or two, but I have to say first, just let the church say amen to what we've heard already. A great series of talks. I want to take a moment and thank Jackie Harris again for putting things together so beautifully. There are never enough opportunities to thank Yolanda McKenzie, who's, I don't know if she's here still, but thanks for her. There are many other people who helped to make today happen, but I want to single out those in particular. And as you think of a question that you might consider, I'll take 45 seconds. And this is not a summary, but just a kind of reflection. I want to remind us of the moment when you were told that I met my baby at the local laundromat as part of our deliberation. We were told that not all God's music was in the hymn book. Remember that? We were told that this is a music that has a spirit of frivolity and ecstasy and of the highest aspiration. We were told that this is music that gives us a mirror and that reflects things that are to be heard in hip hop and to be heard in the blues and to be heard throughout the culture. We are told that when we look at the music, it's not a museum piece, it's something that has been activated and that we need to activate as teachers of the music and as carriers of this tradition. This is music that can exorcise the demons out of us as we celebrate ourselves and find the real good path to walk along. So I thank our panel for these thoughts and many others. It's been a wonderful evening with you. Do we have questions from the audience? Sir.
How soon can we get a copy of this show?
Brother wants to know how soon we can get a copy of the show. The show, right? This is the Show Enough show. I do believe, well, there'll be an archival record that will be available through the Center for Jazz Studies. And you can find out more about that, but there certainly will be an archival record. Mr. Dyson.
I see Keffer Burns in the back, one of the great poets in our country. And I know he got 15 seconds about Louis Armstrong, because he talks about him all the time. I mean, I would love to hear what he has to say.
Come on up and give us a word if you don't mind. I don't want to put you on the spot, but here we are. It's great that you could be here.
Michael Eric Dyson is too generous, Aubrey. I mean, you know, Pharaoh. You know, he bigs you up, and me, like everybody here, I'm just a fan. You know, I'm just a fan. But I appreciate the breadth of Michael's knowledge. Always astounds me, and I know he knows hip hop. But years ago, we were on vacation, and I'm trying to think of the name, senior moment, of a jazz musician. And Michael says, Joe Henderson, like he's reading my mind. I said, what? How you know about Joe Henderson? You know? So the other night, we're out to dinner, and we're talking about Charlie Parker, some kind of way that veers into Einstein and genius and relativity, and then we go off into Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So, you know, I don't want to say anything because Michael has already said it all. Michael has already said it all. I think for many of us, and especially in the 60s, there was a misperception about Armstrong. Handkerchief head, you know, crooning coming out of, but he comes out of that minstrel tradition. It was an adaptation. And a lot of folk don't understand because they don't understand the history of the minstrel tradition, which was very subversive. It started out with black folk, not white folk, and then white folk adopted it, put on white face, you know, and ended up, I think the cakewalk is emblematic of that whole thing where white folks do the cakewalk and they're making fun of black folks trying to imitate the high manners of white folks, not understanding that black folks were originally satirizing white folks trying to imitate European high manners. So they end up doing an imitation, you know, a satirization of themselves. But, you know, and folk forget that, that Armstrong was arrested as a kid for carrying a gun and firing it in the New Orleans city limits. And so, you know, a lot of folk don't know. Winton told me this story, and I don't know that it is not apocryphal, but older cats that I knew that knew Armstrong says it sounds like Armstrong. So the story goes, allegedly, backstage, the band is waiting to go on, and Armstrong had a white trombone player. Y'all probably know who it was. Right. And, you know, hanging out with the cats, and he just got a little too familiar and used the word nigger. Armstrong allegedly knocked him out backstage, and so they go on without the trombone player. And Armstrong, you know, wipes the sweat from his brow with his handkerchief, and he says, ladies and gentlemen, we dedicate this first tune to our trombone player. It's called When It's Sleepy Time Down South. And you know, the older cats say, yeah, that sounds like Armstrong could have done that. I mean, especially when, you know, time of Little Rock 9, Armstrong was very upset. The State Department wanted Armstrong to, you know, go on a State Department tour as a goodwill ambassador. Armstrong called him up and said, the government can go to hell. The way they treat my people down south, the government could go to hell. So they went and asked Dizzy Gillespie, you know, can you at least come to a briefing, a State Department briefing? Dizzy Gillespie said, hell, I got 300 years of briefings, you know. So that's all I need to say about Armstrong.
Won't there be another one tonight? Come on. There's got to be one more.
Somebody started singing, Wade in the water.
I'd like to address statements that were made by Dr. Howard and Mayor Baraka. Maybe I don't want nobody to see who I am, man. Who are you? So both of you spoke about spirituality in different ways. Dr. Howard, I heard you, I believe, speak more in the vertical sense of becoming in tune with the divine in a new way, God consciousness, and being between us and a higher consciousness. I'll put it that way. Or a Christian would say, being in touch with the Spirit of God, or God, right? And I heard Mayor Baraka talk about spirituality as something that makes you act. If I heard you right, and I'd like to suggest that having been at the Investors and Investment, actually having spoken there and seen the kind of power you're talking about, I like to suggest that spirituality really is where the two meet, the horizontal and the vertical. I hear what you're saying, but I mean in terms of, I'm speaking, when I talk about the horizontal, I'm also speaking in political terms too, because I know, we know Rod's genealogy in terms of politics. So I just wanted to offer that, because in the Christian tradition, you have, Jesus said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, he's anointed me to preach good news to poor and free people, liberate the oppressed, which Dr. Howard preached, but a whole lot of preachers don't. And then they say on the day of Pentecost that the Spirit came down on the people in the upper room who were sitting around scared to death, and when the Spirit came down, they got off their rusty dusties and went out and changed the world, right? And so I just wanted to offer that, because so often spirituality is not talked about in fully holistic terms, And for Christians, you can't have a cross without the vertical and the horizontal. So it's not a criticism. It's just something I just wanted to raise because it comes to my mind. Yeah. Thank you.
And this is Professor Reverend Dr. Aubrey Hendricks, a wonderful writer and member of our community. So thank you. Troublemaker.
Question just about you had mentioned something about the redemptive nature, the redemptive suffering.
That means we've been redeemed.
I just wanted to know about that in terms of jazz being an expression of this redemptive suffering.
That's all right. The mayor talks about how we've always been in trouble. You know that phrase or song, been down so long, down don't bother me? That's right. Aubrey has just said something very important, and to leave that unaddressed would have been tragic. What I was really talking about is the truth of mortality, and the way mystery is as much a part of our reality as this bottle that I can pick up. Okay? And I would say that that's the vein that I deal with. We don't comprehend the meaning of life until we come to terms with the exit that is certain and the mystery that governs how we. And by the way, I mean, this is something you subscribe to. Categories of life, that's a fairly new phenomenon. I mean, if you read the Hebrew text, they weren't operating on Greek categories. And African life is exactly the same.
They didn't have an afterlife.
The other is foreign to traditional African languages. It's totally integrated into the whole. Therefore, the sacred and the profane is distinctly European in its construction. And as we say it, not so pretty, we say, without Saturday night, who needs Sunday morning? That's right. See? And the woman who is turning it out in the club is singing the lead soloist in the choir. I don't know, am I getting close to what you're...
I was just trying to get to the idea, when you said that, it was a profound statement to me about how this redemptiveness of the expression of
church right there.
Well, it's turning complete ugliness into utter beauty.
Right.
That's our heritage. If you read blues people, you know, look, you know, my problem with political power, economic strength, total unity among the people, is that we're going to kill the blues. You get it? Do you get it? No, you don't. Yeah, I missed you on that one.
But what do you mean, what is your question about redemption, though? You're saying that's different than redemption. So what are you asking? I mean, really?
No, I just wanted to get an idea, because there's this idea of redemptive suffering as a form of redemption as a form of suffering.
Right.
Yeah. Well,
I thought that
yeah.
they've all kind of addressed different parts of that.
Right. Well, I think that really what the mayor did, probably the greatest intellectual among mayors in America. Who's going to doubt that? Who's going to doubt that, right? Who's going to doubt that? And I know Tanya over here as a book agent is already trying to cook up a book for you, so I'm warning you right now, she's going to hit you with the book idea right after this, because you're the coldest, most poetic, most philosophically acute mayor we've got operating here. So, but when you think about, you know, redemption, right, and suffering, you know, automatically we're going to think of Gandhi, we don't think of King, right? We're going to think unearned suffering is redemptive, right? What the mayor is offering is a theodicy, an argument about the disjuncture between destiny and merit. What you get and what you think you deserve. That's why you suffer, because there's a gap between the idea. Weber talked about that, right? So there's a gap between what you think about that you deserve and what you end up getting. And the distance is expressed through our sense of grievance and suffering. I think the genius of what black people have done, and both Reverend Howard and Mayor Baraka talked about it, is the fact that, you know, the Saturday Night Live skit with white folk going crazy after Trump's election. Jiminy Cricket, it's the worst thing ever. My God. And Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock standing in for the blues, standing in for jazz, standing in for hip hop and gospel, look at each other and go like, shh, right? Really? I guess you forgot about slavery, Jim Crow, right? You can see, right? They're going like, no, because our trajectory and arc is so deep that what the mayor said has always been bad. Been down so long, down, look up to me, right? So the question is, it's not simply about the normalization, it's about the reversal of what you see and I see. Donald Trump is what black people have been warning America about for 400 years. But white folk couldn't hear it until the shit happened to them. And when whiteness turns against whiteness, this is fratricide. right? This is fratricide. White people going, it's like that doctor. You're treating me like a black person. Right? That's what America is saying under Donald Trump. You're treating me like a nigga. You talking about me, calling me out my name. Donald Trump has treating America like we've been treated all along. That's why we are the experts at this moment. Finally, we know what it means to be treated like niggas. So we got something to say. And you know what? We could write books. How to deal with crazy white people in a time of hurt. We know what that story is. And that's what the jazz has been wailing. They're anticipatory theodicies. Right in the music itself, in Coltrane, dying at 41. When you think about Lee Morgan, right? When you think about, I think about, I was walking with Stanley Crouch on the streets of New York, going to see Lou Donaldson down at the Village, right? And I was talking to him about, man, how do you deal with all this craziness? Because a lot of people, Stanley Crouch is one of the greatest geniuses, right, ever. Like ever. Even if I disagree with his politics and be arguing with him, the sense of swing that dude had. And he said, oh, it ain't gonna be no deep thing to tell, because when it comes down to it, people gonna say, I'm on one level and they on another, right? That sense of self-possession and authority and confidence in the face of assault by white people is what black people have majored in. That's why I still argue that at its best, right? Don't forget, that was Baraka on the 20th anniversary, right? When we celebrate 20th anniversary of Lauryn Hill. That's his schoolroom that they got on that classic album. That's him talking to those kids. And this is where I would hesitate to disagree with anything the mayor says. I'll just add to it, right? You need to listen to hip hop with your kids to understand what they hear, as Farrah Griffin says, to understand what they already know and what the gaps are that they don't know. And when you listen to it with them, you can point out when I'm talking to Nas, it's only right that I was born to use mics, and the stuff that I write is even tougher than dice. I'm taking rapping to a new plateau through rap slow. My rhyming is a vitamin hell without a cap, so smooth, criminal on beat breaks. Never put me in box to your shitty tapes. And then he says, I never sleep because sleep's the cousin of death. So I said, you know that's Shakespearean. He don't even, right? This is no conscious. It's even better when people say, well, the fact that he didn't know that he was making reference to a predecessor culture of literacy predicated upon Shakespeare. No, nigga, he even smarter. He came up with this shit on his own. He didn't even know. That's how cold he is. He doing Shakespeare as an 8th grade dropout in New York City. That's better. That's greater than somebody like me who's been to school and who knows what that stuff is about. So when you listen to hip hop with your kids, this is why I love Farrah Jasmine Griffin being on. I know it's not her alone, but we got to give her love because you know what kind of genius she is. On the Pulitzer Prize Committee, awarding it for the first time to a hip hop artist, right? The jazz of its day in that sense. 1918, Good Housekeeping magazine, what was the name of the story? Who put the sin in syncopation? They wasn't talking about Snoop Dogg. No. They're talking about what you spoke about, what Reverend Howard spoke about, the brothel. They're speaking about the bottom. Started at the bottom, now I'm here. So in that sense, the redemption is not the same kind of redemption where we overcome through the sacrifice of our bodies a certain kind of opposition, though that too. I think in this sense, the redemptive character is that it insists upon our humanity despite our dehumanization. And that redeems white people and others as well. What King understood so much more than most other people is that the blood that was shed, that is unearned, that suffering will not only save us, it will save the very people who think they're doing God a favor by killing us. That's what we have to offer to white America right now. So black people need to really be writing books right now, because we've saved the world in that sense. But that's what I would say today.
Let's have one more question, and then we'll adjourn. Go right on. Well, there's a mic right here. Oh, here, I'll give it to you. No, don't come out. Excuse me.
Okay, I hear what you're saying, Brother Dyson, about hip-hop. But I think what Reverend Howard may be saying is something that I feel anyway. Yes, we can get through the poetry and the spontaneity, those elements and aspects of black music. Mm-hmm. But what we are losing every day is the blues. as a concept, as a structure, as a process. The blues, that 1-4-5 change, is worth listening to just as it is and embellished as it can be. I mean, look at what the English people do. What's the young lady's name? I thought I had to go to rehab, but I said no. Amy Winehouse, right? To make a long story short, the people you see who appreciate that now, the people who are giving credit, therefore, for beginning with the blues are white people. They're the only ones who, at least are the folks who are out there on the radio and wherever else, they're the ones who have adopted it, and we as black people have just kicked it to the curb. Now, if you see something shiny and it's nice and nobody else wants it, you're going to pick it up, and that's what's happening. The blues can be for everybody, but that does not mean we who have originated it have to be shut out from it. That's what I worry about as far as our young people are concerned.
I know the mirror.
I want to say something because I got to go too. But I just want to say history is in motion, right? It's not static.
That's right.
History is in motion. So our people, like, look, the evolution of our music is based on our social conditions. And the social conditions change based on which epoch of life we're in, right? And our kids are responding to something very particular, though it's in the same genre, is very particular to the now. And so their expression of it is going to be similar, but not the same, right? And if it is, they'll be static. What you see other people doing is adopting a period of our history and then placating or elevating that period of our history because they like it, right? They like the blues, how it sounds. They like the jazz. So they adopt that a part of us and kind of freezes us in place.
Right.
But we are very, we're very fluid. We move.
Right.
So, I mean, what the young people are doing is expressing the now.
That's right.
What we have to do is make the relationship.
Right.
And they don't know the relationship because nobody taught it to them. Those people that are playing blues heard it. They heard it. They studied it. And that's the difference. They studied it. Some of them studied it formally. Right? Some of them studied it because they listened to it all of their life in their household, and they said, that's sharp. I'm going to try to do that. And so they begin to do that. And some of them even have a relationship with it in terms of what they feel about humanity, and they think is right, and we should do this, and I could sing this, and I can do this too, the same way they was doing it in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. But our kids don't have that history. All they know is what's happening to them. So they are expressing our history in the present sense. Right. As it has moved, right? As it has moved. It is not frozen in time. And that's it.
Okay. Can I say this? Can I just jump very quickly? Brilliant what the mayor said, and I think to piggyback on that, therefore, if people take a biopsy, an extract of living tissue from your own, biology, your body of music, and then use that as the representative sample, what I hear the mayor saying, is that they're freezing the process of growth. Literally, the biology continues to. Howard Thurman said the greatest thing about life is that life itself is alive. And I think in that sense, the greatest word in black culture is next. Right? The greatest word in our cultural creativity is next. What succeeds the prior thing. When people ripped us off, good to see you, Mr. Mayor. When people rip us off, we invent something else. They take the blues, we do something else with it. They take that, we do something else with it. And guess what? It ain't just the young people. People in church were denying the legitimacy of the blues, which is the irony of the fact that Thomas Dorsey, playing for Big Mama Red Thorn, all those blues singers, smuggled it into the church, and then the gospel sound was seen as evil, and then those who were listening to the spirituals, right, the spirituals themselves were contradistinct to the development of blues because blues is rooted in secular culture that worshiped a God outside of the ordinary theological norm. So it wasn't generation, it was genre. The Negroes inside and the Negroes outside. So in that sense, they were resisting it even as they interpreted the blues themselves and interpolated them into their music. So I think that you're absolutely right in terms of not knowing. When I go to blues clubs, you see mostly white folk. And ain't no bluesmen or blueswoman alive going to be mad at white folk for supporting them, right? Because they got a career to support and so on and so forth. But the thing is, when you look at how Eric Clapton, when you look at the Beatles, when you look at, think about it with what's that?
Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan. I mean, the whole thing, right? Mick Jagger, the appropriation of that blues, the rearticulation of that blues for their benefit in terms of economic benefit as well as existential one, that's when the creativity of black people kick in and we do something else. It's going to be interesting to see what comes after hip hop. I mean, that's the wonder. So I agree with you, sir, absolutely. But I think the mayor is absolutely right, and Professor Griffin is absolutely right. We got to listen to, understand what the new blues is, the development of what that sound is. That particular form you're talking about is genius and will survive and should survive. But the other forms being produced right now, that is the beauty of Kendrick Lamar winning a Pulitzer. It begins to certify and validate, not that it needs it on its own terms, a kind of music that has been marginalized in terms of the recognition in the culture while it's dominant globally. I mean, the beautiful thing about hip hop is that it got a global audience without the regular channels. It didn't, look, a guy was selling something out of his trunk. 8 weeks later, he sold 500,000 copies, and the white corporate executive went, you weren't on radio? Like, you cussing so you can't get played on radio? And you sold 500,000 copies? We're denying the genius of our kids in developing alternate circuits of distribution that allow the consumption of an art form that they themselves prize. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. It's just that I think that other level has to be taken into account when we talk about the blues that our kids are producing that are on a new method and a new mode.
Well, I have a short comment to make. The blues now is being, how should I say, marketed as country music. If you pay attention to the country music that is played on all of these reality shows, it is blues music under another name being perpetuated by another group of people from our society.
Yeah, especially the old stuff, right? I mean, Hank Williams is like white agrarian blues.
Yeah, the great percussionist Neil Clark.
Well, just in terms of a cultural contextualization of this conversation, just 3 points. You know, I'm gonna come from the African side. Anybody who knows me, I'm gonna come from the African side. First, in terms of the blues and us putting it down and it coming around, Langston Hughes talked about it in Notes on Commercial Theater. They got a blues and gone, et cetera, et cetera. They got a hip hop and gone. They got a, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then bringing it back into the cross and what we talked about with spirituality and that the significance of the cross, basically what we're talking about is the Congo cosmogram and the 4 moments of the sun, in that we have birth, we have maturity, we have death, and we have regeneration. So that cross, the life, the world, God, the world, the ancestors, and coming around. So in terms of what Michael was talking about, in terms of that regeneration, yes, Langston Hughes, they got our blues and gone. We do put it down, and somebody picks it up and capitalizes on it. But to Michael's point is that what is the new innovation that is coming from the innate creativity and spirituality? And just one more point of contextualization. Randy Weston and Billy Taylor at 2 different times talked about being on the panel for the Thelonious Monk competition. And so I got this directly from Randy, in that he complained about the fact that the contemporary contestants were not playing the blues. There's an interview with Billy Taylor where he also complained about the fact that the contemporary contestants were not playing the blues. And it's very interesting because a very, 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 very well-known musician was also on the panel at the same time with Randy and Billy. And when Randy complained about the lack of the blues, what he was told was, Randy, you've been in Africa too long. Those are my points. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So we really have to adjourn now. What's that?
One sentence rebuttal. Why does it have to be either or instead of both and?
That's what we asking. That's what we asking.
Let's let that
Amen.
brother's word be the last word on both ends.
Amen.
Amen. Thanks again to a wonderful
Ashe.
panel.
Hell yeah.